Number 1, Bellator is putting on a pay-per-view on June 24th. It's kind of a little bit confusing, actually. It's Bellator NYC, and it's also Bellator 180, which, I got to be honest, just from a marketing standpoint, I don't know why you would give something 2 names. I think it's a little slightly confusing, but, do what you want, I guess. It's $49.95. And that's a big question that, last week when I had Kevin Iole on from Yahoo Sports, we were discussing this. And, whether or not it's a good idea, bad idea for Bellator to get back into the pay-per-view game. They've only done it once before. It was kind of a disaster. The card itself was not good. You had Michael Chandler losing to Will Brooks, which I don't think the promotion, really thought was going to happen. That fight was supposed to be Michael Chandler against Eddie Alvarez. Instead, Will Brooks comes in, beats him on short notice. You had a pretty sloppy, maybe not necessarily sloppy, but not a very compelling fight against Rampage Jackson and King Mo. They're going to try again. Sophomore attempt. They got Chael Sonnen, Vanderlei Silva, Fedor Emelianenko, really pulling out all the stops for Bellator pay-per-view. Chuck, my question to you is $49.95. How many people are going to buy this thing?
Well, I don't anticipate that many. I feel like they're using Madison Square Garden, their foray into New York City, as an extra featured character in this whole thing. And it is, man. I mean, we were both out there for the UFC's their show in November, and it becomes a big deal. It's cool to be in that, what everybody considers the fight mecca, and for the second promotion, I guess, to make that headway and get in there as well, that's a big deal. But when they mentioned that they were going to put on a show as when they went to Madison Square Garden, they're going to put on the biggest show they possibly could. They were really going to stack it. I think I still anticipated there being something with a little more substance than just the relics that they brush off. And I'm not trying to be cruel. I mean, I know that these guys have brand names, and everybody knows who Vanderlei Silva is. Everybody knows who Chael Sonnen is at this point. And that fight, that's been in our imagination for a long time. But I still feel like it falls short, only because it's too big of a novelty. And even if you go back to UFC 173, when they were originally trying to put this on, and then they were trying it for the Tough, I think it was like the Tough Brazil, whatever they coached that finale, and then they tried it again at UFC 175. The fight never, I don't know how you feel about this, but the fight never really resonated with me all that much anyway. Chael Sonnen particularly, he's a specific kind of guy. He generates a lot of enthusiasm for his fights, but for some reason that dynamic I never was pining to see that fight, even though they had their kind of history going, and the fight on the Tough show and all that, the little brawl that they kicked up. I just never wanted to see it. But then you get 3.5 years removed, and I feel like it's lost pretty much all of that value that it had, except for the names themselves, and then the kind of rekindling this whole thing and bringing it back to light. But to me, it's not exactly the type of pay-per-view. It's not a pay-per-view. You know what I mean? I thought it was like the second or third best fight at UFC 175. It wasn't really the pay-per-view draw. And then you get Matt Mitrione and Matt Mitrione fighting Fedor Emelianenko. That fight was dangled as a free fight up until the 11th hour of the last time they were supposed to meet on Spike TV, and then it gets recast from with a paywall. And that to me is also very strange. So all told, man, I mean it's a strange fight card. I feel like they're selling New York City. They're selling old brand names and things with a little bit of extra incentive, with Lorenz Larkin and things like that. But overall, man, I can't get behind the pay-per-view part of that.
I think it's Bellator not, and you have a hard time saying this sometimes because I guess I just have this natural inclination to trust the people who are making these decisions, and they must run the numbers beforehand, and they must have realistic expectations. You just hope that the people making these decisions do all their research and they come to a correct conclusion. So a lot of times when I'm speaking about business, I hesitate just personally because I'm like, well, there's got to be something going on that I'm not quite sure. But to me, this seems like a terrible idea. It really does. There's no other way to say it. There's not another way to say it. Bellator is not a pay-per-view company.
Exactly.
It's a television company. So you're asking your audience to pay for something that they're used to getting for free, and then you're putting on. And I spoke about this last week. I don't want to just repeat myself, but you're putting on fights that are at risk. of not coming together. I mean,
Right.
you look at the top fights on this card, and you just wonder. We say it kind of tongue in cheek, but we also say realistically, will this fight happen? Is this fight going to happen on June 24th? You can't.
Absolutely true.
And as a consumer, that has to go through your mind as well. I
mean,
think
the two top fights have been booked. I mean, a collective total of 4 times, and none of them have ever come to fruition. That is a huge concern, and especially with a state, New York State Commission that is new to the game, and we've seen a couple of things come out of that already, where they're raising red flags that traditionally other commissions haven't, and so you wonder, you do wonder about that. It just seems like a philosophical card at this point, in a large part of it, just because of that.
Selling pay-per-views is difficult. We see that from the UFC side. You need certain athletes and special athletes, and you need certain situations. And I agree with you that I think they're looking at New York, and they're going to try to sell just that New York. I mean, obviously they are. It's built into the pay-per-view name. It's Bellator NYC. Yeah. But I just don't know. You water down your schedule, which we saw that happened with the UFC itself. At UFC 205, they put on all of these fights, and then cards suffered for months because of this, just because you basically threw on all of your top fights. And so that's going to affect Bellator. And I just feel like Bellator was in this spot, Chuck, where they were getting a lot of positive press. A lot of people saying, like, oh, man, look at the moves that Bellator is making. It's bringing in top talent. It's cultivating the talent of their own. You talk about Aaron Pico on this card, James Gallagher of Ireland. And you're like, look at all the great things that are happening with Bellator. And I think if this thing is a disaster, which it could be, be a disaster, then you almost kind of shoot yourself in the foot by making this a pay-per-view. So, again, you trust the powers that be. One thing I wanted to ask you about before we move on to headline number 2 is that sometimes, all the time actually, a lot of people like to brand different media members as, pro-UFC or anti-UFC. They love to do that. People on social media especially, they love to do that. So, to be fair, I do want to bring up the UFC's pay-per-view schedule, and I said this right off the bat, that the fights have not been outstanding so far this year. How would you compare this pay-per-view to what the UFC has put on pay-per-view this year? You got 2 to compare it to. You got UFC 208 and UFC 209. So how does it compare to that when you're talking about paying for something?
Well, and that's an interesting thing. I was writing about this recently. If you put it against those 2 particular pay-per-views, I think it stands up pretty well. Honestly, the UFC 208 was one of the worst, pay-per-view. You were asking for a pretty large stretch of the imagination to get behind that card. You had a belt that was created out of thin air, and sort of and tossed up for grabs without an iota of a future of that division. There was nothing behind it. There was no direction that it was going. I just didn't think, that to me seemed like the first big stretch of a pay-per-view that I've seen in a long time. So if you're stacking Bellator against that, I would give the nod to Bellator. I feel like there's a lot more compelling storylines going on in this. There'll be a lot more fan interest. I just think that you're right, though. The UFC started out from its very earliest origins as a pay-per-view company. You're paying for this spectacle at the time, and it's slowly evolved. But the one thing that's kept constant, obviously, is its pay-per-view component. So everybody knows when there's a bigger event, even when it is shy on the depth of a big card, and but there's still a number attached to it. So, for instance, UFC 210 coming up in Buffalo. There's just still a reverence to that. There's this accepted spot on your calendar coming out, if you're an MMA fan, that you might want to dish out for, because it's a UFC event. You know what I mean? In that sense, I just feel like with Bellator, that's what I thought the lesson was learned the first time they did it, was that it's not easy to change people's minds on that when they're used to getting stuff for free. You can't just all of a sudden put a paywall on and expect people to jump aboard and see it as that kind of event. And that is the challenge, I think, for this card coming up, in June. It's just that's the way we're structured. I just honestly believe when you think like, oh, Bellator, it's always on for free, and then suddenly you're asking for money, that's going to catch a lot of people off guard, even as it approaches.
Yeah, and by putting all of these high-profile names on one card, you're paying out a whole lot of money. I just think when Bellator looks back on this, we need to move on, so I don't want to continue, just hammering this home. But what is a victory for them? I mean, I really do think that for Bellator right now, victories are won by putting on cards that people are talking about and it's brand awareness. It's raising that brand. And maybe this will do so just because it's everything that they've got, and they're consolidating it down into one night. And so they're going to get a lot of publicity. But then again, I wonder just how that's going to affect them over time. And if something goes wrong, then you're just having a lot of negative press, a lot of negative feelings towards something that a lot of people are feeling positive about at this moment. And then, you look down the road and it's like, well, what does this do to our schedule over the next 3-4 months? It really waters it down. So it's an interesting choice. Fight game, there's not a crystal ball that tells you exactly what's going to happen or exactly what the best game plan is. You're kind of doing this on the fly a lot. We've seen that with the UFC as well. This is a sport where you deal with things as they come up. They're making this move, and we'll see how it goes for them.